Welcome everyone to Stats and Scheme with Tage and Shawn. I'm your co-host today, Tage Seth, here with Shawn Syed. We had a very upset-filled week of football. Lots of things to talk about. Shawn, what do you want to talk about first?
We're going to talk about a bunch of defensive performances we liked. But first, Tish, I have to know, you were at the Michigan-Indiana game this weekend. It was rainy. I want to know the stats and scheme of how you kept dry in that game.
Yeah, it was true. Big Ten football. And from my high school sports days, tennis, golf, I had a lot of rain gear. So fit check wise, I was in rain shoes, rain pants, and had a rain jacket on. I had nothing that showed I was affiliated with Michigan on outside, like it was my sweatshirt was underneath because I was doing whatever I could to stay dry. Had to do that so that I could enjoy the rest of the day in Ann Arbor. But I mean, it was a fun game. Like I think there are a lot of cool things that you see when you have the all 22 live. You don't have to actually wait for it. So that was fun.
All right, enough college talk. I mean, we can get to the dry socks over expected maybe on the replay, maybe after the show. But another rainy game in the Midwest, Cleveland Browns, real surprising win against the 49ers, which that keeps the stats and scheme curse going since I think we talked about the 49ers offense first last week. I just really enjoyed going through the Browns film. Jim Schwartz just continues to put together great game plans. And for me, this one really started up front. The Browns, they do a good job of sort of building different fronts. So they'll start in a 4-down look and then blitz a linebacker into the center. And that can change the math for the offensive line and how the play is blocked on the fly. And we know Kyle Shanahan wants to conflict your linebackers, make them uneasy with motion and post-snap movement. But Schwartz's defense takes that conflict and kind of throws it out the window when linebackers are just running full speed downhill at the center. They also did something fun on the back end where they would have a safety rotate in the box, and then that player would actually take the crossing route from the other side of the field, which is often just such a problem when defenses play against the 49ers. They played really sound on the back end when they were in their match zones. They played a bunch of cover one, really tight in the second half. Their DBs, they just impressed me all game. I think Grant Delpit, he wears number 22, just made a bunch of tackles in the box, and teams that can play nickel, rush with four, win when they roll their defensive backs into the box, and those players are actually plus run defenders. They're so difficult to deal with, and the Browns, I think, have been that all year. So, Tej, how did you feel about that game? How did you feel about the Browns defense, and what are the numbers telling you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you broke that down there and the stuff that you laid out. We were really excited about this matchup specifically, 49ers offense versus Browns defense, because statistically, the Browns have showed up really well the whole season, but there's been some caveats in their defensive performance when you look at what people have been saying. They had a 100th percentile performance on defense against the Bengals, but Joe Burrow was playing injured, 99 percentile against both the Steelers and the Titans, but those offenses aren't known as being great. But this game they were playing the best offense in the league. They were playing a team that just put up 42 points on the Cowboys. And yes, you can say it was rainy and there was some bad weather, but they had a 97th percentile performance using success rate in this game against the 49ers. And I know the 49ers had some injuries, but the 49ers are a very, very good team. And we've seen Kyle Shanahan mask some injury issues and weapons issues before. And the Browns really took it to them in this game. And through the first 6 weeks of the season, the Browns have the best success rate of any defense since 1999. So this is up there with the 2019 Patriots, I think about as one of the more dominant defenses that I've seen in my lifetime. And then you also think about some of the other defenses that are known as like top end defenses, like the 2008 Ravens, for example. So I think that we're starting to see more sustainable defensive performance from the Browns defense right now, because early season defensive metrics are often which types of quarterbacks you faced, but the Browns have faced a grab bag of different quarterbacks at this point, between like the different styles that they played and some of the different levels of quarterback, and they've done really well against all of them.
I love just the fundamentals of the defense, the way that they were able to handle the screen game, where we've seen so many Kyle Shanahan screens just go all the way. And of course, they let up that touchdown on that. I think it was the first drive where they had the nice little filter screen to the left, but they're able to let their linebackers just go after that. And you didn't see the issue where maybe a few years ago you see it more, where a linebacker is kind of going to fill the gap and then they have to bail all the way back. They just let those guys play fast and they trust their safety and their kind of, I think it may have been a safety body, but at the nickel corner spot in the box where yeah, like they're light personnel, but it plays so heavy, which is so fun. And then of course we have to talk about Myles Garrett. He is so good. And then having him on the edge where he was able to win at different times, and then they'd have Zadarius Smith inside. So you're compressing that pocket. You're forcing that quarterback to step up if the defensive end is kind of getting the edge, and they're stepping up right into Zadarius Smith through the middle. So I think Jim Schwartz is doing a good job being creative up front and then stunting from 5-man rushes, which is something we just see a lot of now, where the defense is forcing the offense into that man-to-man protection and then saying, look, are you going to be able to shuffle and trade that off at full speed when we have guys that are really, really good to do it? And then really small things like on the last drive, the Browns, they changed their leverage and man coverage because they're expecting certain type of routes. And as you said, I think there's a lot of things you could say, whether it's really rainy, the highest likelihood is the 49ers are going to be playing games at home, hopefully later on in the playoffs, and you have a ball slipped out. And there were open receivers. I'm not going to say there was no one open, but when your pass rush has the ability to just quicken that quarterback's clock just a tick, it really is a waterfall effect where they have to get through their reads quicker. And if you miss that throw by an inch when you're playing man coverage like the Browns do, that leads to that interception. So I don't think it's something that the 49ers need to be like super worried about. I don't think that it's like a formulaic answer really in any way, because I don't think that people have the Browns personnel. If you can have those studs up front and guys on the back end that can cover. And then Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, I thought, played such a good game, where a lot of times I think in the NFL, we sometimes overrate hybrid type of players just a bit, because you really need to have a role and play well at that role. You can't defenders that are just playing 17 different positions. Sometimes they lose a little bit in one or lose a bit at the other, but he was a player that just had a really, really good game at linebacker. And hopefully now, I don't even know if the Browns are on the bye next week. I don't want the curse to keep going. I don't want the team that we talk about first just to lose the next week. But I agree with you. I think it's a sustainable performance because they're really, really good.
For sure. And I mean, they're going to have games where they let up a decent amount of points, because it is really tough to sustain a high level defense for 17 straight games in the NFL. Like even the 2019 Patriots I talked about earlier, they had their run in against Lamar Jackson on Sunday night in 2019. The Browns had their own run in against Lamar Jackson, which is kind of funny there. And I really like how you brought up the defensive line. Like, I think you have to be a fan of what Jim Schwartz has done with this defense so far this year, but you also have to be a big fan of Andrew Berry, the GM, and how he's built up different areas of this roster. You think about Andrew Berry's timeline as a GM and what he's kind of focused on each offseason. He comes in his first year and it's all offensive line. He's signing offensive line free agents. He drafts an offensive lineman with his first round pick, and the Browns go out and have this really great offensive line. And, a couple of years later, he focuses on secondary, and he drafts Greg Newsome, and, make sure that Denzel Ward gets his long-term extension, and, Grant Delpit gets healthy and starts stalling for them, and JOK, like you mentioned, and everything. And then this year was all about defensive line. And he really wanted to make sure that Myles Garrett was not going to be left out on an island again. And Myles Garrett is an awesome player, as we know, and is playing at even a higher level this year, stats-wise, because he has so much help on his defensive line. He has the 5th best EPA plus minus of any defensive lineman this season. So the 20% of plays that he's off the field versus the 80% of plays that he's on the field, he has the 5th widest gap between those two. And then some of the other defensive linemen that they have, Okoronkwo has the highest tackle for loss rate in the league. Like I think that's been some really impressive performances from him as well. And then everything you mentioned in the back seven, like I think it's really awesome to see that synergy between this really stout defensive line and then how that back seven is playing, especially in man coverage.
Tej, I feel like we're like the coordinator promotion podcast here, because I feel like whenever, we're talking about really a good offense or a good defense, and it always feels like in this situation, it's Jim Schwartz, where now people, your mind starts thinking, is he going to get a head coaching offer next year or something like that? And we had TJ McCrate, who he's a former scout in the NFL, and I think he crossed over with Jim Schwartz, maybe with the Eagles, but he wrote an article about maybe what his prospects are going forward. And obviously that's so interesting, because we're saying, hey, he put together a really, really good defensive game plan, and head coaching is obviously so much more than that. Me and you, we don't need to pretend that we know what goes into that. You can listen to Thomas Dimitroff on the podcast on Mondays and Wednesdays, talk more about that. And a head coach in a really tough position is Robert Salah. And the second team we're going to talk about is that Jets defense. And their defense executes at such a high level. They play quarters base coverages, and they just communicate like they are a hive mind, even when they're missing both of their starting cornerbacks. So they'll play palms or two read to sides where there's two detached receivers, where the coverage, it can end up looking like cover 4 if the inside receiver goes up or goes vertical and inside, or it can play out like cover 2 if that inside receiver goes out to the flat real quick. And against the Eagles, they played a lot of half quarter and quarter half, where the difference between those two is just whatever is played to the nickel or the passing strength side. And we will get to the defensive line, but those linebackers are something else. CJ Mosley and Quincy Williams, they just erase space. They get run-throughs in the run game. They can really, really cover. And something I love about them is, offenses will do what they can to make linebackers cover, especially against defenses that play those split safety coverages, because a linebacker is usually responsible for relating to the third receiver to a side, which, that's often a running back. And both of those guys just have no issue doing that. And probably my favorite thing going through the film is they just don't cover grass. So there's not times where they're just in space looking around kind of for something to do. They relate to receivers and getting to passing lanes and squeeze those openings. So, Tej, I could talk about the Jets defense all day. What thoughts did you have on them, and what did you see on the numbers end?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, that was great how you put it out there and talking about the different levels of their defense. From a stats perspective, I thought that the specific game plan was really impressive because the Eagles do this on purpose. I'm pretty sure they have a lot of variance in their pass rate in each specific game. Like we'll see in week 1 against the Patriots, for example, they had a +7% pass rate over expected when adjusting for down distance, score differential, and general situation. Week 2 was a -12% against the Vikings because of the looks that they saw and their game plan going into that game. And they kind of just alternate and change up their pass rate depending on the defense that they're playing. And so this game, the Eagles wanted to go heavy pass. They went +12.7% pass rate over expected. Made a lot of sense since the Jets' top 2 corners were out in Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed. But when they wanted to run the ball, the Jets made sure that they couldn't do that outside of Jalen Hurts runs. DeAndre Swift ran 10 times for 18 yards. Boston Scott ran 2 times for 2 yards. Kenneth Gainwell ran 2 times for 13 yards. So Jalen Hurts was the only rusher on this Eagles offense to be able to generate positive yards. And then when Lane Johnson went out, the Jets really caught on to the Eagles not wanting to run to the right side. The Eagles only ran 1 play to the right guard and 1 play to the right tackle. And so they were just avoiding that side together with a backup tackle in there. And then the Jets were just smothering the runs to the left side, like you mentioned. So I just think everything that the Jets defense did from that perspective, where even though they knew the Eagles were going to pass a lot, they still could come out and make sure that they were just completely taking away that running back run game, especially DeAndre Swift, who's had a really, really good season so far. And they made the Eagles focus solely on the pass. Was a really good game plan by the Jets, and then great execution by the players.
I'm glad you mentioned the right side of the line, because whenever I review the Eagles every week, usually the first thing I'm writing down is advantage on offensive line, advantage on defensive line. And going into games like that is so nice just watching them. And the Eagles have their second right guard in Sua Opeta. And then, as you said, they lost their right tackle. So yeah, that's the whole entire right side of their line. And the Jets, I think they knew that the offense wanted to slide to Quinnen Williams, as you should. He is incredible. And they sent a few overload pressures to the quarterback's right side. And that's also where the quarterback wants to bail out to, right? If they're rolling right, they can throw it a little bit easier. We saw that just wild play where Jalen Hurts is stiff arming someone, getting dragged down, and then makes a beautiful throw. But they were able to delete those early down runs and then create havoc and stay in the game. The Jets are happy to beat you in their regular overfronts, but they're also used a load front where you have both defensive tackles to one side of the center, and then usually a linebacker kind of steps up over the opposite guard. So it becomes like that 5-0 look, similar to how the Browns do it, or the Patriots are, of course, famous for doing that. And that can open up different stunts, different loopers. But when teams blitz or when teams are doing those stunts, it's not just for the player that's looping around. It creates one-on-ones elsewhere that are really, really important, because if you're on the defensive line and you feel comfortable with that matchup, especially when you're the Jets, where, I mean, like, is Bryce Huff ever not going to get a pressure? It's just his pressure rate. It seems so wild. And then I thought Jermaine Johnson had a really good game where the Eagles had 4 turnovers, which that is a real tough way to play a game and to win a game. But really, each time the Jets put themselves most of the times in really good situations. So on that kind of weird interception to Dallas Goedert, Jermaine Johnson is kind of bailing out. He traces his steps, feels that screen. And yes, that's a wonky bounce of the football, but a player still has to be in that spot. And then when on the DeAndre Swift fumble, right, your linebacker still has to get into space, get that punch out, and then you got to recover it. So that was another situation where when I was watching the game, it felt like, Eagles are probably going to come away with this, but just full on hats off to the Jets defense. I thought the Eagles played pretty well on the offensive end, especially 2 out of those first 3 drives. Seemed like the plan was working for a bit. And to be a Jets team where you're not always getting everything from your offense, right? You obviously don't have your first quarterback in there. For them to win that game, it's just, clapping my hands for them.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'm so glad you brought up Bryce Huff, because he was like one of the small sample size kings last year that was doing really well on limited snaps. And then he goes to this expanded role this year, 2nd on the team in sack rate, 1st on the team in tackle for loss, like someone who really just jumps out to you every week. And yeah, I mean, I like what you mentioned with like the Jets offense, where you're not going to have great games from the Jets offense often, just because of the state that they're in with Zach Wilson starting there over Aaron Rodgers. But I think when you have Garrett Wilson, who had plus 2.4 total EPA on the day, and then Breece Hall, who had a 78th percentile rushing performance, when you have those 2 things together, both these sophomore superstars at their positions, you can lean on those guys and just minimize your negative play rate. The Jets only had a 6.9% negative play rate, which was 79th percentile in this game. And when your defense forces 4 turnovers, that's not necessarily sustainable, but when you understand that in a descriptive sense, as long as you're not making negatives and you're getting the balls to Wilson and Hall, I think that's a formula to stealing some of these games. And the Jets sit at 3-3 right now, like a very interesting situation, probably not where they expected to be if you told them Aaron Rodgers would have gone down on the first drive of the season. So I think it's a good spot for them to be in, where you still have this elite defense from last year that's still playing really well this year, and has done well against Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and now Jalen Hurts, like some of the top 3 quarterbacks from last year in terms of total EPA, and they've really taken them or given them a tough time in these games. So I think Jets fans should be pretty encouraged by that for sure.
And just going through the notes, there's just so many instances where I just kind of like feel like I'm putting an exclamation point. The Eagles, they had Devontae Smith in the backfield a few times. They were running in breakers. Not sure if maybe it's a choice route, but yeah, they let up a catch on it. But the linebacker is like right there. And to think of a linebacker that you feel comfortable with covering Devontae Smith in space, like that's just so awesome. There was an awesome snap where the offense is running mesh rail, which we all know is your favorite play, where really you just got all these crossers going over the middle. You have a running back going up the sidelines, and they're just passing everything off. And it's hard or you see pass off sometimes where it just happens from one linebacker to the other linebacker, but they do a pretty good job they understand how to pass off from the corner to a linebacker to the nickel. And you'll see clips where you can just see like everyone pointing with their right hand, like they'll throw their hands in the air so that the other defenders, I'm sure they're saying it too, like under, so that they can feel that route and they're passing it off. And that makes life hard on the offense. They do a good job on the defensive end of, yes, they're playing quarters-based structures, but the defense is going to look different based on what routes the offense runs. So one thing in quarters is when you have a safety to a side, if it's just 2 open receivers, you're looking at that second receiver. If the second receiver is not going vertical, say it ends up as a tight end where they're blocking, they'll have that safety go close the middle of the field, right? Like go cover something. And that's something that maybe a few years ago, we get a little frustrated when it looks like defenders are just dropping to a spot and not really doing anything, which is a defense that has merit because they're trying to close windows. The Jets they're really a boa constrictor. And I think for both the Jets and the Browns, that's a good example of rush and coverage marriage, where the rush, if your rush is really, really good, your coverage, it can, not that it can be bad, but it doesn't have to be as perfect every single time, because I think as you've talked to me a few times, like coverage isn't always the stickiest thing in the world. There's sometimes
Mhm.
just the way a receiver catches the ball, or it's a 50-50 ball, it ends up in the receiver's hands, and then your stats might look a little bit worse. So I'm glad we got to talk about the Browns, the Jets. For the third topic, I just want to talk about some of the kind of leftover notes in the notebook for a few other teams since we're going full defense. But all right, first, we made it to 20 minutes in. If people want to turn it off, that's fine. Let's go Lions first, because Tej, you're not afraid to say you're a Lions fan. It seems like this has got to be like the first time in your life where you're feeling it on this one, right?
Mhm. Usually when I tell people I'm a Lions fan, I like say it really quickly and just try to like continue with the conversation. This is the first time where I can just say it like pretty proudly, and like I want to make sure that they hear this time that I'm a Lions fan. And yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about Lions defense a couple times this year, but I mean, it really, as we go through some of these quick defenses here, like another great defensive performance from the Lions. They've only had one game this entire season where the offense has had a positive EPA against them. So the Lions defense has had 5 out of their 6 performances be above average defensive performances. And this game from the Lions, like they played pretty well, got a little bit lucky on a tipped interception and some missed deep balls on open receivers. But like the overall soundness of the defense, when you go from what was the defense like in years past to what it is now, how Lee McNeil is playing up front, Cam Sutton being a really, really good corner for them that they were able to sign this offseason. And they didn't even have Brian Branch in this game, and you still felt pretty good about the secondary against Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Like, I think that was very encouraging for this kind of banged up Lions defense to play well in Tampa.
So I think they're number 2 in DVOA. If they get to number 1, are you hanging the banner, or are you already just buying your number 2 DVOA jersey? How are you doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's when the Colts hung the banner for AFC, divisional finalists or whatever. Like that's something that's the equivalent to this here. Number 2 in DVOA, you got to hang the banner.
Look, I mean, the flags fly forever, right? I think, yeah, the
Yeah.
Lions defense, it continues to be very fun. You got Isaiah Buggs, who is that the best name
Mhm.
in defensive football? Maybe. He had a huge deflection at the line where the Bucks just have a wide open receiver running down the field that's either 70 yards or a touchdown, and you get a defender's hand on it that ends up as an interception for the Lions. There was a 2-play stretch where Alex Anzalone was in coverage in the slot on an option route, and he did a pretty good job on it, and then he had to cover that rail route where the running back is running up the sideline out of the backfield. And he was really competitive in both of those situations where offenses are designing those plays for that matchup. And I think Anzalone's just been playing really well. He had that sweet tip against the Packers that we talked about. Something we got to talk about. I thought the Lions did a really nice job defending the hiccup concept, which is a concept we've talked about here because the Lions love it so much on offense. Really, in hiccup, you talk about the offense wants to sell boot to the defense before what is usually a corner route is going to break back into a wide open space. And when the Buccaneers ran hiccup against the Lions, the cornerback passed off the crossing route to the middle of the field safety and then took over the middle of the field, which put him in the exact right spot to cover that route. And that may be something that, hey, when your offense is running that concept in practice over and over again, you get used to it. And it was really cool because you rarely see that covered. So I'm excited for Brian Branch to come back. You know how much both of us are just the biggest fans of Brian Branch. But all right, if you have any final words about the Lions, I'm sure we're going to talk about the Lions next week. I think they have the Ravens. What else? What else do you want to close with for the Lions?
Yeah, the one other thing I was going to mention was I think this is really like a redemption arc for Aaron Glenn. He had a lot of doubters throughout his last couple of years here in Detroit because of the defensive performance. He's ranking bottom 5 in EPA per play on defense for a couple of years now. But like I always thought he was trying a lot of stuff, but he just didn't have the guys to execute it with. You think about the one double that they tried on Justin Jefferson last year, completely shut him down. But then Adam Thielen went for a huge day. And it was different stuff like that where they just always didn't have these secondary pieces. And like Brad Holmes has done a really good job building this roster, making sure it has depth. And I think Aaron Glenn finally has all these defensive pieces that he can really do some of his defensive schemes with. And I think that's been pretty exciting to see both coordinators for the Lions, do really well this year and rank pretty highly in different play caller metrics.
All right, now we can return to our objective examination of football that we're done with the Lions. I want to talk about the Texans. I like what D'Amico Ryans is building with the Texans defense, and I loved their double mug package in week 6. And double mug just means you have two linebackers lined up in the A gaps, which is the space to either side of the center. It forces the offense into certain protections, and it can be a way to get the offense on their heels. It isn't an every down defense, and the Texans bought it on 3rd and long, and then towards the end of the game in the 4th quarter as well. They had a 6-man pressure to a 3-by-1 set where the linebacker further away from the trips ended up taking that number 3 receiver while a safety was still in the middle of the field. They ran a 7-man pressure cover 0 where the nickel ended up working right through the middle over the center. They ran a coffee house stunt where a linebacker sort of turns to the sideline and pretends like they're dropping for a second before rushing. And they even had a 5-man pressure with dropouts that lets the defense still be sound in coverage with 3 over 2 to a side. I enjoyed that variety. It seems like every week we like what we're seeing from Houston. I think obviously we're talking defense today, but CJ Stroud is just continuing to do a really, really good job every week. It's going to be interesting to see where they kind of end up in the division. Tage, you got any feelings about the Texans?
Yeah, no, I like what you mentioned. I think that, again, like Texans fans have to be really excited about what's happening on both sides of the ball right now. What a stat that I was looking at that I thought was really interesting about the Texans was they've forced a negative 3.3% pass rate over expected. So teams are running the ball against them more often than the average NFL defense if they were put into these situations. And like that's pretty close to what the Browns defense is. And we've talked a lot about that defense. So I think it's interesting, like how offenses are respecting some of the pass rush things that they can do. Will Anderson already getting a lot of respect, and some of the other pieces that they have in their pass defense where they feel like they have to run the ball against the Texans, which we know like oftentimes a run is usually going to be less efficient than a pass. So it's good that the Texans are forcing offenses into running against them.
The Bengals Seahawks game was also a pretty fun one on defense. I'll let you lead off with the Bengals. You got anything there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the Bengals had like a pretty uncharacteristic slow start to the season. I thought we were really high on their defense coming in, as were most people, and they didn't have a good game against Baltimore. They had a really bad game against Tennessee, but these last 2 weeks we've seen them kind of crank up the dial on defense. The Arizona game, obviously, they did really well to kind of slow down Arizona's rushing and passing attack, but now against Seattle, they were playing as much of a bend don't break defense as you can, and I really thought that they turned up the notch here when they were in the red zone. I think Seattle was 1 for 5 in the red zone in this game, and that's really where you saw Lou Anarumo's defensive schemes come through. They were getting a lot of pressure on Geno Smith, forced a turnover, like all those things that where we saw Geno Smith not have a game that's at the level we're used to, I think was in a large part to what this Bengals defense was doing. And obviously Trey Hendrickson is playing amazing football as usual, like really, really putting himself up there with the top edges in the league.
The Bengals defense, it's going to be one that I think we're going to continue to like more and more as just more games go on. I like that they're versatile on the back end. They'll run cover 2 creepers where the nickel is blitzing, the defensive end away from that nickel is dropping. They'll send 5 against you. Against the Seahawks, they were able to take advantage of a banged up offensive line. And DJ Reader up front is just a player I just love to watch so much in the run game. I think he does an incredible job with leverage, understanding how to get off double teams, and just playing with extreme strength. I think a common thing for just a lot of these teams is I love teams that can play their regular nickel groupings, 4 down linemen, rush with your hair just absolutely set on fire, which may be unsafe, and then have safeties or slot corners that can get involved in the run fit. That sort of structure, like if you can pull, I think, one through line, especially for the Jets and the Browns, that's kind of like, I don't want to say it's a blueprint. I don't think it's something that everyone can just replicate left and right, but it's like it's just like I don't know what the word, it's not like a natural way, but it lets your defensive lineman be so aggressive. And you probably have to build your team front to back in that way, which sometimes I think recently we've been thinking, you obviously want to limit the explosive pass play, but one way to do that is also through the defensive line. In that Bengals Seahawks game, just want to mention the Seahawks really quick. I think their tape is just looking better as they're getting healthier. They're a team I like because the way they manipulate the fits up front so often, whether it's sending that slot defender off the edge on a pressure or doing different things where they're kind of like creating explosives on defense. They had that sweet interception on, I'm pretty sure, just a back shoulder throw where it feels like teams understand that against the Bengals, you have to be hyper aware that that specific back shoulder throw is coming. So they're going to play underneath it a little bit. It looks like the cornerback's almost turning their head a little bit early. We saw the Browns do that in week 1. And I think it's just something that you have to understand. Joe Burrow is extremely good at that. And to get an interception, that particular one from the Seahawks was just like, it was so wild. I feel like so unbelievable to see that. But saw the Rams do it against the Eagles, where as a cornerback, your life is so hard. You're going to have to figure out ways to stop those back shoulder throws. And then of course, as Joe Burrow, they go into the bye week, get a little bit healthier. I think just, when your offense is clicking it, that also is just going to make life a lot easier on your defense.
For sure. And yeah, to touch on 2 things that you mentioned there, the 4 down defensive linemen and, kind of having that back 7 solidified where the corners can fit on runs. Like that is, I think, like the most optimal way to play defense. But again, you have to have the 4 defensive linemen to do that with. Not everyone has that. But when you think about like how Brian Flores is just grinding in Minnesota this year, just trying to get everything he can out of that defense, because that defensive line isn't at the level of like the Jets and the Browns and other teams that we've talked about. When you have to blitz 5 and 6 and you don't get that pressure in under 2 seconds, under 2.5 seconds, like I think that starts to become a worry. And when you're watching games live and if you're rooting for a team or just observing in general, like when you see a team blitz and they don't get pressure right away, that's like an uh-oh moment for you as an observer. So I'm sure like defensive coordinators feel the same way. And then like going to the Seahawks defense, who I was impressed by in this game also, I thought it was particularly impressive that they let up those 2 touchdowns to open the game, and they really just locked in the rest of the game. I thought you still can kind of see that because of the younger pieces that they have in their secondary, there's going to be moments like that where they let up 2 passing touchdowns early in the game. But when you see like the rest of how that secondary is playing right now, I think that's very encouraging as Seahawks fans, is like you're going to have these pieces solidified for a while in the secondary. Even though we talk about coverage fluctuating, I think that the talent is evidently there, and that's what's exciting about it.
I'm glad that you mentioned that's the optimal way that we would kind of draw it up on paper for how you would do it. Because defense, it's not always about what you want to do. It is so much about what you have to do, where you're covering up for maybe a weakness or a player's hurt here or there. And yeah, I love Flores' his way to just answer your problems with aggression. And it's really frustrating on the defensive end when you just have offensive coordinators that are just like, I mean, I know we're off the lines, but we ask every week, how is Ben Johnson going to drop a touchdown? This week, it was to Jameson Williams on a bunch flood concept. In flood, you're creating 3 levels with your routes. You have something going vertical deep, something in the flat shallow, and then an intermediate route that is usually the target because of how the defense is stretched. The Lions ran a version of flood from a condensed set where instead of just an outside vertical as the deep stretch, they ran a pylon route, which more or less just a deep corner route. And because that intermediate route was there, the defense is rolling their safeties. The cornerback has to take that intermediate route from Amon-Ra St. Brown. And Jameson Williams is in a foot race, breaking away from the leverage of a player that is trying to rotate back. And he made a great adjustment on the ball for this week's Ben Johnson touchdown design. Tish, how does it feel to just have an offensive coordinator that literally, like, we joke about it when we text each other, like, oh, I wonder what Benny J is going to come up this week for a big touchdown. Like, I mean, that's gotta feel great going in as a fan, right?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing is it's always a secondary receiving option, because St. Brown is so good at those intermediate routes and like getting yak out of it. Like Ben Johnson will do it with Jameson Williams. He'll do it with Laporta or Reynolds or Raymond, and those types of players, that I think is really exciting. And then, Jameson Williams here is starting to become the most efficient player in NFL history. I think he's only had 6 touches in his NFL career, and it's gone for 40+ yard touchdown against the Vikings, a 40-yard end around against the Bears, and then this 40-yard touchdown here against the Buccaneers. So on a very low sample size, he's going to break a lot of charts for me as I continue to make these. So that was cool to see Jameson Williams have that catch there, especially after him and Goff had kind of like a miscommunication type on the comeback route where Goff threw it a little bit short. So he redeemed himself 2 plays later, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I do think he looked pretty explosive just running. There was like a kind of like a regular curl route on the left side where it seemed like he broke it off pretty well. And that was obviously a small thing, but really comfortable where he's looking really, really explosive in that way. And he doesn't just have to be the kind of blow the top off of a defense guy. I want to talk about, I guess, two teams where maybe we won't talk about it too much, but the Jaguars, I think we'll probably get a chance to discuss them in the future. Hopefully after a big game, I'd expect them to be in the running for the division towards the end of the season. They played so much base against Indianapolis and just refused to allow runs, which is fun when our defense is really, really challenging you. And I thought Josh Allen really stood out on that defense as well. And then the Chiefs, we actually haven't, I feel like, talked about the Chiefs at all, where that's obviously a top team in the league. And they're a defense that they're, I think, just playing super sound. I think we'll probably get to talk about them more next week when they play the Chargers stage. Is there anyone else you want to get a little shout out before we head out?
Yeah, no, those are great. I've been so impressed by the Jaguars defense this year. They've been so good at not allowing explosives and also really like not allowing teams to get into drives where they're getting past the 40-yard line. Like I think just the combination of the Jaguars doing that this year has been awesome. And we're going to get them here on Thursday night too, which will be pretty cool for a lot of people to see the Jaguars not at 9:30 in the morning when they're playing in London, actually at night, which will be a really fun game. But before we go here, I want to hear which game you're the most excited for. I think I know the answer, but just for the listeners. So we have Lions Ravens at 1 p.m. Eastern. We have Chargers Chiefs at 4:25 Eastern, and then we have Dolphins Eagles, the Sunday night game at 8:20 here in Week 7. Which of these are you most excited to watch?
Oh man, Tej, you're making it hard for me. Yeah, those are. I would be so surprised if those three are not the games that we talk about next week. I'm so excited for all of them. I'm gonna say Eagles Dolphins. Obviously, I know I do so much about the Eagles that maybe that's a little bit of bias, but I mean the Dolphins offense is so good, and we could talk about them first on the show every single week. Mike McDaniel is absolutely incredible. They're doing so well in so many different ways. And the Eagles secondary, like I'm not surprised if like Howie Roseman calls up me and you to play up DB for that secondary. They're on like their fourth cornerback, their fifth safety. There's just so many injuries in the back end. And Shawn is doing an awesome job. They're playing really, really good up front. And that's going to be an interesting style makes fights game because yes, the Eagles defensive line is great at getting pressure on you. That just doesn't matter when Tua is able to get rid of the ball in like under 2 seconds to someone that's like 15 yards down the field. So you were talking about breaking grass before. It doesn't make sense. Like the less time that you have to throw, you shouldn't be able to get the ball downfield that far. There's just not enough time for people to get down there. So I'm excited for that matchup, obviously, because I want to see what the Dolphins do when they celebrate in the end zone. Are you just going to say Lions Ravens? That's the one that you're looking forward to the most. You're going to be sweating that one, I think, pretty big.
Yeah, I mean that'll be a stressful game. Like the Lions usually don't blow teams out in before this season. They have a little bit this season. Obviously looking forward to that game. But I'm with you. I think that Sunday night game is going to be so much fun. And like Tyreek Hill right now he's the offensive player of the year, I think, even over Christian McCaffrey, because Tyreek Hill almost has a 5 yards per route run season going right now. He's already at 814 yards, 6 games into the season, and Nico Collins is second in yards per route run at 2.97. So Tyreek Hill is 2 yards per route run higher than the second best in the league right now. The gap between him and Nico Collins is as big as Nico Collins and like the bottom of the barrel receivers that have been running out for some of these offenses this year, like Sky Moore or something. So that's the craziest thing about what the Dolphins are doing. Like you mentioned, like we usually see that inverse relationship between time to throw and average up the target. You think about the infamous Tim Tebow 2011 season where he had the highest time to throw of any quarterback in any season ever, and then also the highest average depth of target in the league. Like those things go hand in hand, but the Dolphins have found a way because of Tua's quick release, because of how quickly Waddle and Tyreek Hill have been able to get down the field, and because of Mike McDaniel's scheme to really get this. So, it's going to be really interesting to see how the Eagles defensive line ends up, if they end up becoming minimized in this game because the Dolphins get rid of the ball so quickly. But the matchup that'll be really fun to watch is all of the outside runs that the Dolphins have been doing to Mozart, where he often has a lead blocker, whether it's Alec Ingold or a receiver that went in motion. how the Eagles defensive line is going to respond to that, because their edges are really good, as we know. So it'll be, like you mentioned, like styles makes fights. It'll be a super cool matchup to watch.
Yeah, I think across those three, right, the defensive coordinator versus offensive coordinator matchup is just going to be so fun. We got our guy Mike McDonald against Ben Johnson and the Lions with the Ravens defense. Obviously, Vic Fangio, who spent time with the Eagles, against whatever is going to happen for the Eagles offense with that offensive line. I do think you can run on the Dolphins defense, so that's going to be something that, right, we saw from the Chargers in week 1, and maybe the Eagles are able to do that, but it's hard to keep up with those turbo fish. And then Chargers Chiefs, right, we got Spags against the Chargers offense. Obviously, Chargers off, not the happiest moment, I think, for Chargers fans on Monday. But all right, real quick before we go, keep saying that, but to me, Tyreek Hill is, I think he's just the best receiver. He's really like a running back in the open field, which is crazy. Obviously, I mean, like, what worth is it to rank them? I don't think it makes any sense to, but like, it is so different in the way that he wins than I think like Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams. Like, if I made you just choose one receiver, and you can't choose Amon-Ra St. Brown in a Lions uniform, he's doing great again this year. Like, is Tyreek Hill your pick there, or do you lean somewhere else? Do you lean more of like a Megatron build with your Lions homerism?
No, I think that's a great question. And definitely like the hypotheticals that get thrown around are always fun to talk about. I would take Tyreek Hill over any receiver for one season right now, because I think like it's one, like you said, like how dynamic he is once he gets the ball in his hands. He's underrated at the catch point too. Like, he makes a decent amount of contested catches that people don't usually associate with him. But the other thing about Tyreek Hill is he makes it so much easier for your other receivers, because defensive coordinators play man coverage so much less against him, because you do not want to play man coverage against Tyreek Hill and have one of your defensive backs get burned. So it's like the entire defense is knowing that, or the entire offense is knowing that they're going to see zone on 80, 90% of snaps when Tyreek Hill is on the field. So it's a lot easier to think about as a receiver when you're running a route, if you know you're going to see some type of zone. How about you? What do you think about for those three receivers?
Yeah, I mean, I got to watch so much Justin Jefferson last year around Viking stuff. It's obviously stylistically different. I choose Hill, but I do think it's an example of, you have a really, really smart mind in Mike McDaniel with a superstar in Tyreek Hill. Yeah, it's kind of like when you got your mic, like when you have a smart person and you give them something that helps them succeed. It's like is Hill able to get that same ceiling without McDaniel? I mean, candidly, probably yes, but it would look a lot different. I'm glad that you mentioned he's a really good route runner. I think that is something that is hard to contextualize when he is just running straight by people, but he does, I think, have the ability to get in and out of his cuts really well. And where defenses prioritize putting a roof over the offense, like, it just doesn't exist when he's there. All right, let's get out of here. So we really appreciate everyone listening to us. Again, got a little rambly there. I'm glad that we get Tej to talk about the Lions. Keep the feedback coming. Let us know what you like, what you didn't. And especially if you think Tej is a little too optimistic for the Lions. I know he's got a lot of scar tissue built up over the years. Be sure to stay tuned to Sumer Sports podcast feed. Eric and Thomas do a great job Mondays and Wednesdays. Check out our website, sumersports.com. I think Tej and everyone has done a really, really good job of putting together a lot of good data that is free, that anyone can look at, that it's customizable. You can filter it in different ways. And I think it's a good way to just keep up with what's going on in the league. And we will see you next week.